Hello and welcome to a new episode. My name is Robin Bevan and today we're gonna go into psychological complexes. In the last episode we went into the shadow and the persona and briefly mentioned there also that psychological complexes also tie into that and are within the shadow. Understanding psychological complexes and then also the inherent duality between the two poles of the complexes is also key in resolving unconscious content. And with that, content within the shadow, which applies to both personal unconscious, complexes, that's more tied to the individual, but also the cultural complexes within the collective unconscious as well, which similarly have such a duality. Jung being the one who introduced the concept of complexes. And these are amalgamations of thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and memories centered around a singular concept. And the impact of a complex on an individual intensifies with the number of elements associated with it. Occasionally, complexes emerge as a mechanism for ego defense. Consequently, they possess both positive and negative dimensions, exerting influence on a person's behavior and decision-making in either a favorable or unfavorable manner. Viewed as quasi-autonomous components of the psyche, complexes can exhibit a life of their own. While not universally negative, a complex becomes problematic when it excessively dominates or negatively interferes with an individual's life. And Jung's perspective on complexes is widely accepted within depth psychology, a field positing that a considerable portion of personality is shaped by unconscious processes. Within this framework, both personal and cultural complexes are integral facets of the psychological landscape. In psychotherapy, the exploration and resolution of complexes, particularly on the path to individuation or wholeness, becomes important. Because unresolved complexes persistently wield unconscious, maladaptive influence over thoughts, feelings, and behavior, hindering the attainment of psychological integration. And personal complexes arise from individual experiences, distinguishing them from cultural complexes, which are culturally codified and consequently culturally reinforced. Jung often used the term complex to describe a partially repressed yet highly influential cluster of charged psychic material split off from or at odds with the conscious I, so the ego. And you can see them as lumped together groups of thoughts and feelings that create behavior patterns and have somatic ways of expression. Concerning its nature as feeling-toned, Jung wrote, "A complex is the image of a certain psychic situation which is strongly accentuated emotionally and is moreover incompatible with the habitual attitude of consciousness. And this image has a powerful inner coherence. It has its own wholeness and, in addition, a relatively high degree of autonomy, so that it is subject to the control of the conscious mind to only a limited extent, and therefore behaves like an animated foreign body in the sphere of consciousness." Complexes are also often associated with unconscious motivations and desires, and they can arise from a person's experiences, beliefs, and values. Some common examples of psychological complexes include the inferiority complex, the scapegoat complex, and the savior complex. And psychological complexes can also be difficult to identify and address. Complexes, according to the Jungian psychological perspective, are functional units of the psyche that are related to memory and learning, but have a degree of autonomy from conscious control. They are not passive, but can act on their own, and in some cases have a purpose of their own. So complexes can be thought of as partial personalities, but should not be given more autonomy than they actually have, as in the end they are almost like scripts that repeat, which is one way to spot them, to look for repetition in behavior patterns. However, they can also go somatic, so display symptoms in the body that can't be explained. Next to these complexes, being able to cause a block in the flow of vitality and keep parts that are within the shadow locked up, which includes traumatic experiences. And complexes are the result of the interaction between instinctive drives and the environment, particularly in childhood and early relationships with primary caregivers. Instincts drive, the child to bond with the primary caregiver and form relationships, but if these relationships are not fulfilled, a complex forms. And the term archetype is often used to describe these interactions between instinctive drives and the environment. What is most important, however, is understanding the instinctive drives and how they shape the complexes. Especially the parental complexes are important when it comes to how we relate to the other sex. And these are psychological concepts that refer to a person's unconscious feelings and thoughts about their parents, particularly those that are derived from their childhood experiences, which also influence the development of the anima or animus, which are the masculine and feminine aspects of the psyche within, men and women. And as you can see here, there are different levels to this. There's the undistorted archetype, there's the trauma that is tied to the repressed affect as well, which blocks, this undistorted archetype away from being accessible. Where there is the personal complex within the individual, which is unique to their individual experiences, influences their beliefs and behavior. For instance, if we look at the one tied to, the feminine, can be split into polarities, where we have the nurturing mother and the devouring mother, and the witch. Where the split between witchcraft, rebellion, feminine power, outsider, and other related themes, versus nurturing motherhood, self-sacrificing, traditional, and other related ones. And these can be also perpetuated in distorted archetypal narratives, which is the cultural complex within the psyche that has its own personal manifestation within each individual. So even though, there's a general theme within the culture, how it manifests within the individual is pretty personal. And the cultural complexes tend to manifest itself within the archetypal narratives within the culture, which can be distorted. And a good example of that would be, for instance, how Nazi Germany distorted the choreos pattern. Something that we're gonna, go into deeper way later when we talk about the choreos pattern. But as I said earlier, complexes have such a kind of duality within them. Two poles that need to be reconciled, and only when these two poles are reconciled, the complex is worked through, and the repressed affect can start to come up and be expressed. And the undistorted archetype can be accessed within the individual. And complexes can have a powerful influence on a person's behavior and relationships, and can manifest in various ways, such as an unconscious need to compete with or imitate one's parents, or an unconscious desire to rebel against them. The next biggest one being the inferiority-superiority complex, which is a psychological concept that describes a pattern of thoughts and behaviors characterized by feelings of inadequacy and insecurity, alongside an excessive need to feel superior to others. Yet also, when it comes to the anima, animus, shadow, and other archetypes, the form they are is formed partially by ego consciousness, but also outside influences, and partially by the unconscious. The outside influences can form within a person a complex that has an effect on the archetype. Let's use the animus as an example. If a person, for instance, through an outside influence, think through childhood experiences, has negative interactions with masculine figures, this can shape their animus, thus forming a complex. And this complex then also tends to warp the archetype into a particular shape and form, which is only a part of the full spectrum of the archetype. Now think a negative animus that then forms. And when we deal with a negative animus, we are really dealing with a complex, which is a collection of thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and memories. And like I said earlier, these are held together by a single concept, which is called a core belief. And the complex can be seen as encapsulating the archetype, which is on a deeper layer connected to instinct and draining the archetype of energy to keep itself alive, next to the ego as well. Often through flinging affect at ego consciousness when it goes against what the complex wants. Because in the end, the complex wants to keep itself alive and also convince ego consciousness that it is valid. And the complex needs to be overcome when it becomes limiting and ends up distorting an individual's perception of reality and their sense of self. Overcoming it means becoming aware of it, understanding its origin, and integrating it into one's overall self-understanding. This can help to reduce its power over the individual and allow for more healthy and adaptive functioning. And the awareness that it is a complex and that these thoughts, beliefs, and negative emotions flung one's way are not the ego, but the complex, pushes the complex out of the field of consciousness into the unconscious. Next, what is also important is to see the full spectrum of the archetypal energy below the complex, as this also helps to take away the power from the complex, whilst keeping the awareness regarding the complex and the behavior loops it produces. What is also important to factor in when it comes to complexes is that they persist of an internal duality. As long as you only understand one side of the duality and move to the other end, you will still remain trapped within the complex. You have to thus understand the duality within it and thus transcend it. Only then you can free yourself. It is also not just finding a compromise, but a synergy that allows you to truly transcend it. Often, there's also distortion of the complex. There's also understanding the archetypal pattern and connected archetypes that were present within an ancient context can give you a better understanding that is less distorted, thus helping one to free one from that dynamic. Which is also something that we're here doing regarding, Wotan, the sovereignty goddess, and Dionysus when it comes to the scapegoat complex. As these figures are important in breaking that complex down. Yet regarding complexes and finding a middle way, I will within the book go into some examples of complexes as well. And these are some specific examples and, by far not exhaustive. Complexes then also are very personal in their exact structure, even if the underlying pattern remains similar. And the complexes, that I'm going to go into now, which I in the book say below, contain the middle way regarding transcending these complexes. However, archetypal patterns also play an important role and should also be taken into account. The first one being the scapegoat redeemer complex, where the middle way basically is balancing the desire to help others with the recognition that true liberation comes from within, avoiding extremes of self-sacrifice or becoming entangled in others' issues. Even though that is easier said than done, because complexes also require a lot of emotional work as well. Next to that, regarding the codependency independence complex, the middle way being cultivating interdependence, recognizing the value of healthy relationships while maintaining individual autonomy, avoiding both excessive reliance on others and rigid independence. Then you also have the trust and betrayal complex, where the middle way is balancing trust with discernment, acknowledging the potential for betrayal without letting it hinder authentic connections, striving for a healthy trust that is not naive or overly guarded. Then you also have the inferiority-superiority complex, where the middle way is recognizing inherent worth beyond comparisons, avoiding both feelings of inadequacy and compensatory attitudes of superiority. Where next, there's also the loss and vulnerability complex. And here the middle way is acknowledging the inevitability of loss and vulnerability without succumbing to excessive fear or avoidance, embracing vulnerability without letting it paralyze personal growth. And like I said, all of these things are much easier said than done because there's a lot of emotional work that comes with it. Because when these complexes form, they form due to trauma, so there's a lot of material that can come up with it. But finally, if you have that one, and I've had that one personally, which is a very nasty one, is the emotional suppression venting complex. The middle way for that is navigating emotions with a balanced approach, neither suppressing nor venting excessively. Embracing emotional expression while maintaining awareness and constructive coping mechanisms. And tapping into the archetypal energy below the complex then is the final push to overcome the complex itself. And what is needed, though, is the proper reparenting of oneself and the changing of behavior patterns to not reactivate the neural pathways so they can slowly die off. But regarding complexes, there are not just personal complexes, but also cultural ones, like I had mentioned a few videos ago. And regarding the collective shadow, this also ties into the concept of cultural complexes as well, which are complexes shared by a cultural entity, such as a community, society, or cultural subgroup. And cultures themselves can exhibit dualities, which are part of cultural complexes. So the opposite of a cultural trait is also part of the cultural complex. Hence also political ideologies, who often exist on opposite ends of spectrums, as much represent such dualities, and can be seen as their own cultural complexes, with their own archetypal symbolism, and accompanying unconscious drives, often stemming from the collective shadow. And they come with their own sets of values, symbols, and narratives that shape the collective identity of their adherents. And these ideologies may embody certain archetypal patterns and tap into the collective unconscious, where unconscious drives associated with these ideologies can influence behavior on both individual and societal levels. And the concept of the collective shadow is then also particularly relevant here, because political ideologies might arise in part as a response to aspects of the collective unconscious that are repressed or denied. The shadow aspects, when unacknowledged, can find expression in ideological beliefs and societal structures. And these very same parts of the collective shadow then at the same time gets projected outwardly onto what the group sees as other, thus leading to shadow projection and finally also potentially scapegoating dynamics. This can happen within a familial setting, school setting, work setting, and larger societal settings. Within the context of the book regarding Wotan before World War II, Dionysus and the Sovereignty Goddess, this specifically connects to shadow projection and the scapegoat dynamic prevalent within society, this being a hindrance regarding working through our shadow material when this is projected outwardly. We are just like the prisoners in Plato's cave, staring at the shadows at the cave wall. And this book then also goes very deep into the archetypal patterns connected to the scapegoat archetype and their ancient historical context to give you, as a reader and listener, an in-depth insight into the original historical pattern beyond distortions, to free yourself from societal bondage to such complexes and distortions. However, it is important to point out that this is only one of the many complexes. Hence, this should also serve as a reminder for us all to do our part in contributing to the body of knowledge, to write from our own lived experience, learned insights and wisdom, and bring this into the world. As none of us can truly carry the entire collective shadow, only deal with our own personal shadow and the parts that resonate with larger dynamics.